It's time for a new profile pic. But where do we even start? I've been using this happy little pancake for the past 3 years or so now. And it's been fine and everything. But to be honest, I didn't really put a ton of thought into it. It was just a cool piece of artwork that I made and it fit into a circle. And I was just like, well, this is me now. So before we get into it, it helps to ask yourself what you're even using your profile pic for. Are you just having fun on the internet like I was 3 years ago? Or are you trying to build out a personal brand that spans across platforms like I am now? Either way, I hope my advice is useful, but keeping your intentions in mind will help to shape a better profile picture for you. So, without further ado, there are 3 major rules that you need to keep in mind when developing an awesome profile picture. Rule number 1, readability is everything. This might sound obvious, but your profile picture is going to be smaller than the size of a dime. So right off the bat, you need to get rid of any extraneous details within your picture. In other words, simplify your art style. Rule number 2, respect the crop. So if you're going to make a piece from scratch for this, start with a square canvas, and it even helps to make a circle overlay within it that you can turn on and make sure that the important parts of your image are actually going to be within the final crop. And you might think that the circular frame is a bit of overkill, and this is a little counterintuitive unless you've done it before, but an image that's framed well within a square won't always translate to the same image being framed well within a circle. And this is relevant if you have an asymmetrical design, or you're using the rule of thirds, or you're in some way moving away from the center of the image. And rule number 3, composition determines readability. And here I'm not just talking about shape design and where the shapes are within your piece. I'm also talking about value differences, where you're focusing your details, lighting. All of that contributes to the composition, especially at such a small scale. I'm going to focus primarily on the basic kind of headshot because I get the feeling that that's what most people are looking for. But if you want to know more about logo design or using more abstract forms for a profile picture, I guess leave a comment below. Maybe I'll do another video like this to cover those kinds of things. But my best advice for you is to just search for graphic designers on YouTube. There are tons of them out there and it's an entirely different ballgame. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. First up, you need a great reference to work from. Your first instinct might be to look through your selfies and find the best looking picture of yourself. But the typical good looking picture of you is probably, just smiling, pretty generic, doesn't really say anything about you. And the last thing you want to do is be another generic face in a sea of faces. Now, that's not to say that you can't just have a smiling picture of yourself if you're a joyful, bubbly person. But the takeaway here is that you really want to play up the emotion for your reference so that you have that to work with. The best advice I've heard for this comes from Ethan Becker, knife guy. And he says to use video references instead of photo references. Unless you're amazing at acting, it's really hard to pull off a convincing emotion if you're just, posed for the camera. And a good actor, I am not. So I busted out my camera and started recording myself, trying to capture what I was going for, which was a bit of awkward existential dread, I guess, 2020 vibes. As confident as I might come across in the edit, I'm really second guessing everything that I'm doing. And, I wanted to kind of convey some of that in my profile pic. And just to hammer this point home, the reference that I ended up capturing to use here wasn't even something I was intentionally doing. It was as I was moving between different poses and settling, it's literally one frame from the video. But, I went through the footage, I ended up finding it along with a couple others that I considered, and this was the one I went with. And the last point on this reference gathering is your lighting. You've basically got 2 options here at such a small scale, and that's flat lighting or ridiculously dramatic lighting. Nothing in between. To make sure that everything reads, it really helps to have just your face shape as one kind of color. And if you look around at some of your favorite people's profiles, you'll probably see that as well. And the only alternative is really to have a stark contrast where the shadow is and have it really helping to define the form of the face. So unless you're really confident with your ability to couple dramatic lighting with readability at a small scale, just go for the flat, even lighting on your face. Great, so you've got your reference and you remember to work within the confines of a circle. Now what? You've got two main approaches here. You go for the floating head or the not floating head. The floating head is classic, tried and true, easy to read, highly recommend it. You don't need to reinvent the wheel for a profile picture. But if you're going to work in a more realistic style, or if you've got other elements coming into the shot, like how I've got my hand coming up and interacting with my face, it might make more sense to have a bit of the body incorporated into the shot. So when you're incorporating your body into the shot, it's a bit of a Goldilocks situation. You don't want too much of the body showing because then you can't really focus on the face or add any details there. But you also don't want to be cropped in too close to the face because it's just awkward. Like you basically just have a floating head but with neck sticking out the bottom, and it just doesn't work. If you're going to do that, just go for the floating head. So what I would do here is take inspiration from photographers and how they take portraits. In fact, that's exactly what I did. You're going for like a bust of yourself. Get a bit of the shoulders in, not too far, not too close, just right. And a quick note that these are not hard and fast rules. If you feel comfortable doing it, you can crop your image however you want to. There is no right and wrong answers. I'm just trying to provide a good baseline for people who would have searched for how to draw a profile picture. Thank you. Moving right along. At this point, you have your reference, you've sketched in your basic composition, and you're ready to start rendering. And this is where we kick it into high gear with our simplification and composition. Only worry about the biggest, most basic shapes that you need for your image to read. So in my picture, the hoodie is one big white blob, the t-shirt is a dark blue blob, my face and neck and hand are all brown blobs, and my hat is a bluish gray blob. Each of these forms has their own value, and they all stand out from each other, and that's so key. So once you've got your colors blocked in, I definitely recommend scaling the image down and looking at it at the size that it's going to be presented to other people at. If you can't distinguish your forms at this stage, rendering is not going to help you. So go back in and tweak your values until you get something that works and reads. And we're just talking about silhouettes at this point, okay? Details don't matter. And if you're going to use line art at this stage, just remember that the line thickness is probably going to be much higher than you're usually using. Before you commit to a line thickness, do a test and scale the image down again and see if you can even see the lines, because maybe it's not even worth it to put them in. But if line art's the vibe you're going for, just make sure it's actually visible. In my case, I used the lines to help reinforce my shapes, but I downplayed their colors so that they only subtly influence the image. And then inside of my shapes, I used line art for all of my details. Even though my regular style is a lot more painterly, closer to realistic, I didn't want to go quite that far with my profile picture. I wanted to emphasize that it was hand-drawn so the line art makes sense here, and to convey more of the realism, that's all done in the actual proportions of my drawing. Except when it comes to my lips and my mouth in general. And I did that for two reasons. The first one was that the local color of my lips I wanted to keep fairly true to my reference, and they are very similar in value to my skin tone. So because the value there wouldn't really stand out at a small scale, I needed to enlarge the lips themselves and make the shape that my lips and teeth were making a little bit bigger and more exaggerated. It's definitely the most cartoony part of the entire image. And to be honest, looking at it at this large scale, I really don't like the way that the lips look. But once you scale it down, it all makes sense and it reads a little bit better. So, you do what you gotta do. All of that's to say, don't be afraid to push your proportions in ways that you wouldn't normally at a normal sized piece of work. And if you like to exaggerate eyes and mouths, that's just a part of your style, then hey, power to you. Exaggerated proportions definitely lend themselves to images that are gonna be this small at scale. And the final piece of the puzzle is your shading. And all I'm going to say here is that any shading that you do shouldn't detract from any of the readability that you've already established. So in my case, I'm making sure that any of these new shapes that I'm introducing are staying closer in value to their parent object than to anything else in the scene. Like all of the shading on the hoodie is very similar. Like if I blur my eyes, it's still just one big white blob. But looking closer into the details, I can see the hints of shading there. However, for the hat and hand, I did go in and carve in new shapes with their own kind of defined values. But again, they are still very much contained within their parent shapes. They're just adding depth without intruding on the other objects in the scene. So really all you have to do here is, as you're playing with your shading, keep zooming out and looking at the image at the right scale, making sure that what you're doing isn't detracting from the image. And with my shading, I'm still not getting like crazy detailed. There isn't very much nuance within any of the shading going on. I basically opted for flat colors, except for on the face and the hand. And to be honest, even that kind of soft blended out shading was really just for me to feel better about myself. Zoomed down, the graphic kind of outline of those shapes looks very similar to my blended out versions of them. And a similar sentiment goes out to all of the details in your scene. Like, for example, the eyes. I didn't have to render any of the detail in the eyes. In my profile picture, you can't see any of it. They're just two dark pits. But, I felt good about doing it and it looks pretty cool. So just know the difference between rendering something for yourself and rendering for the sake of the final product. And with that, we're just about done. Or are we? The final piece of the puzzle is to actually test your piece by uploading it as your new profile picture. And I didn't record this, but when I did actually upload this piece the way that it is now, I realized that my gradient in the back was actually disturbing the readability of the piece. And even though I'd been scaling my image down this whole time, I never noticed this until I actually uploaded it as my Instagram profile. But the dark purple at the top really just bled into the hat once the image was cropped properly, and it just disturbed the readability of the major silhouette. So once I knew that, all I had to do was flip my background so that the darker part was down towards my shoulders, where there was a heavy contrast between dark and light, and the lighter part was up near the hat, where there was more contrast between the dark and the light. So don't be afraid to keep modifying and tweaking the profile picture once it's quote-unquote done. Most people might have never noticed, and all of the readability in the actual face was there, so really, does it matter? It's kind of up to you. But after going through all the work that I did, I think this was about 10 hours, I guess. I thought it would be a disservice to myself to just leave it hanging. And with that, we're finally done. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this video. Let me know if this was helpful or just kind of useless for you. And a shout out to my 8 subscribers. Thanks. See you later.